history of inclusion started back before the beginning of the 20th century with the Committee of 10. We've had legislation such as ADA, IDEA, and No Child Left Behind to add support to the idea of inclusion. The positives of inclusion are that kids will have more self-confidence and have a higher level of achievement in an inclusion classroom. The negatives of inclusion are that kids will have less self-confidence and lower levels of achievement in an inclusion classroom. Amusing and confusing, we're trying, but where is this all leading? We'll never know. In examining the literature on inclusion, the types of special ed learners that I looked at as they interacted with regular education learners were mild to moderate learning disabilities and mild to moderate behavior disorders. I did not look at physical disabilities in the classroom or severe learning disabilities. So we were looking at things that we might see every day in our classrooms with some of the mild to moderate disabilities we encounter. Give it a different name, we're begging and we're needing and we're trying. For inclusion to work the way we want it to, certain things have to be in place. We need to have intrinsic motivation from our special education students, and that can be from excitement about the lesson to just a desire to learn. We need to make sure we have teacher education for these special education students to feel at place in our classroom, and we need to have supportive peers. When we have supportive peers, then we're going to see our inclusion work and we're going to see it do what we want it to do. If we don't have supportive peers, then we're going to see frustration on both sides for the special education learner and the regular education learner. Things are looking pretty grim if you don't believe in what they're spoon feeding. It's got no feeling, so we'll read it again and again and again. Sure seems the same. So many different names, our hearts are strong, our heads are... Science itself is a great subject for inclusion. It gives a lot of opportunities for students to have discourse and to really talk out their ideas. So when we see a higher achieving learner and a special ed learner coming together to have this discourse, it's really an ideal scenario. It's hands-on. We're making contextually based relationships to the outside world. And of course, it can easily be set up for project-based learning. All these things we've talked about in our iSmart program. The problem is this takes a lot of planning, and a lot of times teachers either don't have the time to collaborate with their special ed teacher to make sure differentiation is accomplished for these students, or they're just not willing to put in the time for a project-based learning environment. So we really have to make sure that these things are in place for these students to have the discourse, to be able to have inclusion actually make a difference. No song that I could sing, but I can try for your heart and our dreams, and they are made out of real things. Even in science, which would seem like such a perfect subject for inclusion, there can be a few problems. If teachers don't have enough resources to do these labs and do these hands-on activities, then we're not going to see these connections being made for some of our mainstreamed kids. Also, we need to make sure our special ed teachers have content knowledge in science. A lot of them are trained in English and math, but don't really have the background in science to help some of these kids with their questions. And also, we need to make sure we have the correct ratio recommended for inclusion. A lot of times we see a much higher ratio in our classrooms than we should. When Kalambuka and his research team looked at 26 inclusion studies, they found that only 23% of these studies were actually positive in their results. 58% were neutral and 9% were negative. And I think that needs to give us pause and question, if we only have 25% of our studies giving us positive results, something needs to be revamped. But I know that they'll be gone when the morning light sings. There are several things that I would suggest looking at for suggested research on inclusion, since we are seeing such mixed results. We need to look at the value of labs for mainstream students and really examine the hands-on research as well as contextual learning and make sure that they are making long-term connections. I think until they're making these long-term connections, we're not really going to see the knowledge retention and the value of what they're doing. We also need to look at how we can restructure inclusion in general to make sure it's appropriate for all students, both our mainstream students as well as our regular education students in the classroom. Currently, neither one is getting the best end of the deal.